Hey guys, I get a chair this time. So especially end of the day, I'm so excited that I get to sit. So this is just awesome. I will tell you, I just echo PJ. It's interesting. I'm equally passionate about this topic because it involves people as I am about fighting human crime. Part of my world is Mission Omega, and we do consulting and build operations teams and such. And really that's to fund the noble and fund the good work that the community's doing. But what I'll tell you is no matter what size of bank that I interact with, we interact with consulting. I spent 3 years at PwC, whether it's top 5 banks, top 20 banks, top 100 banks, credit unions, small regional, building an effective fraud department doesn't stop. And it's interesting. It's like you could have a effective fraud department 1 year, and then you fast forward 3 years later, and it's a complete train wreck, and you're not able to handle it. So I would tell you, for everybody that's in this room, we've heard for the last 1.5 days, there are nothing but challenges. We all know this. Anybody who's been in fraud for more than, 2.5 months knows that. So I would tell you that we need to all pay attention. There's notes for everyone here, no matter your role. And I'm thrilled to be on the panel here. Like PJ said, we've got such a great group. Why don't we start with quick intros? Seth, kick us off.
Yeah, Seth Rudin. I've been in the consulting and fraud space for about 20 years now, with BioCatch currently as their global advisory role. And my previous role was the senior director, the head of fraud for First Tech Federal Credit Union, which at that time was the top 5 credit union in the United States. And I'd like to say that we went from zero to hero. So I got a good story to tell.
Hi there, I'm Erin Verton. I work with Morgan Stanley. I've been there a little bit over 2 years. I kind of grew up in the financial services industry, started my career in a branch opening checking accounts, did that for several years and, well, not several years, about 9 months actually, but then moved on, did branch management and that sort of thing, and I found myself saying, you know what, I could probably be a lot more impactful to this firm if I were to work in the back office instead of in the front office, seeing the impact that fraud had on customers and the employees and what they had to go through. So I had worked with BB&T for about 15 years, went through the merger with Truist, and my career is kind of interesting because it follows like major shifts in regulatory policy sort of. So ID theft prevention program. That's when I started in fraud. I helped centralize identity theft for BB&T and was responsible for that program. Then FFIEC came out with new authentication guidelines. So I moved to second line risk and I was authentication risk officer. Then BEC started being a huge thing and I was helping to write authentication policy for wires, and they were like, hey, come be our risk manager. So it kind of all just kind of grew upon itself. But I've had kind of both experiences of being in the fraud strategy and controls and also being in operations. I actually just took on head of fraud strategy for Morgan Stanley Monday. So it was really great timing to meet with all of you, but really excited to be here and just share a little bit of what I've picked up over the years.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
John.
Hey guys, John Watkins. Been in the financial services industry, about 28 plus years now. Spent time in marketing, fraud, credit risk. Tour duties, started with First Union way back. I see Marianne over there, the Wayback Machine there. Long tour at Bank of America, worked with Synchrony, and then decided to see how life was on the other side. Did the vendor thing for about 4 years with SAS Institute, where I led their work around digital identity fraud. And currently, I work with a project called Genius Bank. We are the digital banking unit of Manufacturers Bank, which is one of the SMBC family of companies, where we literally are building from the ground up a startup bank, startup program, all the compliance, all the fraud from the ground up, with a target to launch here before the end of second quarter.
So you can see we're in great hands, you guys. So a quick show of hands really quick here. Who is in the process of building, rebuilding, or reinvigorating a fraud department? I'd love to see you. Guys, it's like this just doesn't end, does it? I gotta tell you, it's so funny, like having been at certain banks and been there for too long and probably went from zero to hero to zero again many times in my life. I will tell you, it just doesn't stop in the minute we take our eyes off that ball. So I want to start with, we talked about all the different challenges of today, and or the last couple of days, scams and check and synthetics and new account. I'd love to get you guys, just start us off, softball here. What type of fraud department is needed to be successful in this environment today? Again, softball, we'll start off easy.
Well, I'd say an agile one. I think maybe the most important thing that you have is the ability to scale where you need to scale at the moment where you need to do it. Because fraud's going to come from many different sides and many different opportunities, and wherever the gaps that you haven't anticipated exist, because you haven't anticipated all the gaps, unfortunately. There's going to be some blow up in some place that you haven't anticipated, or some channel that's new, which is going to create some new element, or some participant in a vendor, or in some element of a technology stack that's going to break. And agility. So wherever you have those people in those places that you need to scale or create coverage for is the thing that you need to have. So having cross functional teams and individuals who can participate in different areas tends to be one of those things that I think is key to being successful and sustainable.
Yeah, so I think we've heard throughout yesterday and today about just some people with some innovative ideas on different ways of looking at things. So I think you need some disruptors in the fraud space right now. We're experiencing fraud has completely changed, I'd say, in the past 2 years, maybe 2.5 years. So it looks very different, and with a lot of what we've talked about with generative AI and ChatGPT, I mean, it's going to continue to evolve, and we can't keep doing things the same way that we've always done things.
That's so good. I love that. Innovators, disruptors. Yeah, we definitely need an injection in the arm to kind of get us going, a little caffeine or something, especially with these threats that we got going on. So, John, over to you.
Yeah, definitely echo the caffeine piece of it. But I think what's needed today, in echoing the agility and the disruption, you need a group that has courage to fail, because we fail every day in fraud. The crooks, there's more of them. They collaborate. It's crowdsourced. They know how to beat us. But we have to have the courage to fail, to try things, and that doesn't work. You fail quickly, you fail fast, you fail small, you move on to the next one. So that's the thing that I think a lot of companies don't understand, is that failure can be part of the process. But manage it, do it quickly, and move on to the next iteration.
So when we start talking about an effective fraud department, it's made up of a bunch of pieces, the governance and the program, people, controls, technology, all these we're going to go down each of these. Seth, kick us off here. So when we talk about governance and program, so much of what we do has to do with complying with regulations, making sure we pass exams and audits and all the, I don't know, for some it's fun. I would say the not so fun part of a lot of what we do, but it's absolutely necessary, right? So give us some thoughts on what does an effective fraud governance and program look like?
Yeah, I think you start out of culture. I think that's the place that you need to really put your foundation in place, and having a culture that says, to your point and in your mission, I'm going to do a thing. I'm going to create a thing. I'm going to have ethos, and it's going to be a part of everything that I do going forward. So I wanted to be the faster antelope. I wanted to be the protector of my community. And the credit union, that's an environment where you can kind of create that environment. And that's a great thing, because we could do some stuff in scam disruption. We could do stuff in creating counterintelligence. But let me take from the origin story, if you will. So when I first joined First Tech, I was a young adult, and First Tech took really good care of me, helped me to achieve some really great things in my life. So when First Tech asked me to come and lead the team from a very bad crisis place, I was happy to take the torch and bring it up. But I knew I needed to immediately gut the program and rebuild and create something. So maybe one of the first things that I actually did in terms of the culture rebuilding was I actually had them create the brand. I had the team create the brand, and I wanted them to be a part of that, that discussion, and really elevate themselves in how they saw their future. And that was really transformational for that team. And we started with 17 at that point in time. Sounds like a really small number now to look back at it. That team doubled in no time. And this was during the pandemic, so we got it really handed to us. We were in the midst of the Zelle crisis. We were one of the first institutions to really take it on the chin from Zelle ATO. So I made some technology purchases. You might recognize the company that's under my name right now. That was really one of the kernels. But I think what you really got to do here, and I got to have a laundry list, and I'll try to be as succinct as possible, you got to really establish the baseline for the organization and that risk culture as the first thing. Find the risk assessment frameworks that live within the organization already. They're going to exist. Certainly if you're finding yourself in the position like me, you got to understand the audit findings, you got to really take those into inventory, and then you got to start resolving them, make good friends with with the audit people. They're going to help you along the way. Beyond that, start benchmarking performance. You know it's going to be terrible out there. Let's get everything unearthed. Let's take all the skeletons out of the closet, and let's make sure everybody's aware of what we need to do. Because if you can get that awareness and you can get everybody on, on board with your plan, then you're going to be able to funnel those resources, and you're going to be able to get that, the business cases sourced. And that's a pretty critical thing to really realize your objectives. So then identify and prioritize your weaknesses, pick your battles. There's probably multiple crises in fraud that you need to address. Figure out the ones that you want to go first with the resources that you have today. And then understand your vendor framework and perhaps your tech stack. Because from there, what you need to do is you need to put a tech roadmap together. So here's the way that you more or less take that inventory, know where you're going to go from there, and then begin to scale up. So once you're at this point in time, buy-in from partners. So you got to identify those line owners, because these are the people that you got to partner with. Who lives and breathes credit cards and wants to ensure that they're meeting their conversion rates, that they're meeting all their receivable numbers, and you got to set your targets and metrics with them so that you know what the boundaries are and that you can play in the sandbox together, and that if you exceed and they know that you exceeded, then you need to do something big, and then you have the opportunity to really fall back on those thresholds. Acquire those internal audit findings and the plans to put them down. Make sure that they're aware of what your targets are, and mostly you have these in Archers and the other frameworks for putting these away. So you got to start having a plan so that you get the buy-in from these senior leaders to proceed with them. Next, you got to engage the cybersecurity info teams and build on these fusion models. And that was one of the things that really got me pretty far very quickly when they first started to realize that I was going to be an agent for change and help them succeed. And if you can build those fusion programs and you can start having those kind of conversations and building the model for communication, that's transformative in your environment. Engage marketing and communications. You're going to need to have all of those things well enabled. Put together your strategy, your cadence, and your content calendar, and make sure you get your message right, both internal and external, so you're reaching all of the people that need to know. I also suggest really strongly get with your digital teams and partners. These guys are becoming mostly the target alignment seekers that you're going to have within the organization. That's really going to help you to be successful, because more of this online fraud is becoming the greater problem that we're having these days. Although, I don't want to minimize what goes on in card, but online has become quite the more serious problem to solve in my perspective. And then last, you got to execute. Evaluate the team, reorg, identify the gaps, and optimize your talent and put them on a plan for growing. Develop your reporting framework, templates, cadence, contents, and your audience. I had to report to the board of directors. That was a lot of fun to make sure that they got the message every month, but that's how you get the buy-in and ultimately the budget. Legal, compliance, playbooks, processes. We'll talk more about that, I think.
It's a good list, Chad. That really is. I think what I'll tell you is it's the foundation's critical. Aaron, just your thoughts on that. I know you've kind of had roles similar to this where you've had to.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a lot of what Seth just said and some practical things that I've actually applied and done to solve for a lot of the things that he talked about. So people are key to the success of your business, both the people within your fraud team and your stakeholders. So some of the things that I did, so when I joined Morgan Stanley, I can give that as an example. We were going into an E-Trade integration. It just started, I think, the second day in, and I was told, guess what? You need to be planning to close down the Manila Operations Center, and you're going to open a new operations center in Mumbai, and that's going to be your first. Of course, not many people were brought over, the fence for that, so you need to start planning this. So that's a great way to start a job, knowing you're going to have to lay off a lot of people, right? So that's never fun. So what did I need to do practically from a people perspective to make that happen? One, I had to get to know my staff really, really well and understand where I had some talent that was going to be able to carry us through a lot of that turmoil and change. Oh, and guess what? The Great Resignation hit at the same time. So fun. But one of the first things I did as a team is structure and accountability. Extremely important. It's the same thing that I'm applying moving into this new role that I'm taking. As fraud fighters, what happens is when there's a fire, everybody rushes towards that fire. But guess what? You can't have everybody rushing to the fire. Then you can't have anybody building the fire retardant wall if everyone's standing there with a hose. And how many hoses do we have pointed at green grass? So start to look at some of those things really, really carefully, and how can you use your resources better? Because there's going to be ups and downs as far as head count. We're always running into budget things, head count, different life cycles and careers, that sort of thing. So look at where you're spraying the green grass and try to clean some of that up, build some capacity for yourself, build a little breathing room for your people. They'll start to build some trust within you. Then create a vision statement. And then don't just make this be a vision statement that you have this big powwow one time where you guys get in a room and you come up with this vision and it's wonderful. No, that vision statement needs to really be brought back in front of your teams on a very regular basis.
Yeah, it's evolving.
Yeah, and you need to ask questions like, does this meet with what our vision statement tells us we're trying to do? And the other thing that's very important in fraud teams is humanizing of clients. And I know we heard a lot of that earlier with the victims of scams. Humanizing your clients that are on the other side of it. Humanizing your business partners. We all get frustrated with each other. You get on a call and you're like, can you believe John just said that to me? And then we're talking about it behind the scenes. But if you're purposeful in organizing events and sessions where you're bringing people together on a very regular basis that have to work very closely and your success depends on it, you're going to actually see that absolutely pay off in the end. So another thing that I've done that I've found to be very successful is the product teams, your risk partners. So if you have kind of a coverage model and you think about maybe you break it down either by fraud type, sometimes you break it down by product type, but from an engagement model perspective, right, you might have a more junior person on your team that you tell that you need to go have regular connections with this person who's one of my peers, more junior people on their team, and the connect with that person, and you put in a structure of you guys need to map the end-to-end process flow of how we talked. The last session was talking about this. What's the journey? What do our controls look like? Where do we have pain points? And then through these interactions, it's not just the fraud, let's stop the fraud. It's also bringing back to your partners to say, hey, we did an evaluation of our online opening controls, and we're seeing that there's a high decline rate when we look at clients that get through that fraud restriction and actually become established clients. What could we do to work together to see if those legitimate clients that we're stopping up here in the works in the cycle, how could we not stop them on a go forward? So you bring that value back to them. You're not always bringing them, let's stop the fraud. You're also bringing them, let's do a better job for our clients. So those are some practical ways that I found that has helped me build relationships wherever I go in the organization, that it is absolutely about stopping the fraud, but it's absolutely about way more than that, and recognizing that and making sure that you're bringing that to your partners as well.
So I've heard about culture. I heard a bunch around how to start working and supporting businesses. I'd love for you, when you talk about, I think it's building a framework. So we're not reactive, and that's not how you fight fraud. Are you proactive, reactive? But it's reactive how we as fraud fighters aren't running from one fire to the next.
Absolutely.
It's actually building the framework, a response plan, the RACEs. That's all stuff that takes work, and it's hard to measure that and reduce fraud losses. Better customer experience. It's hard to measure that up front, but downstream, it has giant dividends. John, what did we miss?
Yeah, I'm going to build on something Erin said. One word she had was purposeful. I think that's very, very important as you're building out your program, whether it's from a compliance standpoint, whether it's interacting with your people, the people you hire. So you've got the process, you've got the people to help make it purposeful. The technology and the data piece of it is critical. Fraud fighters don't want to sit there and not catch fraud. I mean, at the front end, if you've got frustrated associates that aren't catching fraud, you've got to do something about it. And to do that, you've got to arm it, you've got to have the fuel, which is the technology and the data. And a couple areas there, you talked about agility. I think one of the critical elements for building a program these days is around data. And how do you bring that data in? There's so many different types of interaction, whether it may be a new to us customer, it may be a customer that's returning this that we're authenticating, or it may be transactional, that we need the contextual information to be able to make a decision there at the point of interaction. Don't wait till the money moves. Do it at the point of interaction and build a protective ecosystem. And data is the critical component of that. So, as you're building up, I think that's the cost of doing business. Really identify what are the interactions that you're going to be having to deal with. Start looking, what's the incident rate of these? How severe can it be, and how well can I detect it? So you build out the typical risk management profiles around that, and then start looking at where do I need more data to make better decisions. Step number 2, this starts getting into a little bit more advanced. What kind of decisioning? Data is only as good as what you can look at. You have to have something to be able to make a decision. And ideally, you're automating the mundane tasks so that the people aren't having to work, clear declines or clear outsorts. Get the right decisions and the right analytics in place to get the associates the right things to work, where they can put their expertise to work. You hired them because they're smart. You hired them because they know fraud. Let them do their job. And then lastly, at some point, there's math on the test. With the
I'm out.
with the advent of machine learning and all of the capabilities that a lot of our wonderful vendors have brought to us, as well as open source, we have this robust amount of information that can be very predictive, not only for catching fraud, but for catching good customers. Outsorting those to where it's a frictionless customer experience, but you've done the diligence that you need. So, I'm passionate about it. This is something, I'm a geek from way back, but there are core elements of technology that you really need to enable, both from a measurement and compliance standpoint, and to make sure that your people are working what they need to be working.
So let's talk more technology. So your guys, there's so many technologies out there. So how can you have a fraud department without technology? How do you rationalize? There's so many pieces out there when you make sure you have the right technology solving the right problem. Aaron, just thoughts?
So the first thing is to define what your problems are. So I think that's extremely important. So I'm taking over this new role, heading fraud strategy. Talked to a lot of vendors, and I've been talking to a lot of vendors that are in this room today, and I've told them it's going to be a little bit because I need to define what my problems are and really talk to my teams to understand.
You were very clear.
I was very clear. Understand what the problems are before I just start looking at solutions, right? There's a lot of shiny little things out there, but if I'm constantly, and your teams are constantly going after the shiny things, your stakeholders, you're going to have a credibility problem. So you need to clearly define what your problem statements are and communicate those to your stakeholders. So I think that's probably step number 1.
I can't reinforce that enough. I would tell you, there's no secret sauce on the consulting side, being at PwC, now Mission Omega. One of the key things that we find at the largest banks and the smallest banks is just a void in their fraud typologies, taxonomies, not putting it into their detection systems, their analytics, their reporting, case management. They say they have one, but when you actually ask to define the problem and make sure everybody in your entire department knows what that problem is and that's the foundations that I think a lot of you probably think you have in place. But I think honestly, that's where it has to all start. And I would honestly tell you, it's an ongoing approach to make sure you've clearly defined every year, updating it. Seth?
Yeah, so the thing that I think that's been one of the greatest evolutions in terms of that kind of thinking is the governance model and making sure that you've got really strong governance controls and codifying it. The governance model can be a very big encyclopedia of fraud knowledge relative to your institution, and it can create a lot of massive, it's a massive undertaking, and a lot of resources go into this thing. But at the end of it, you really should be having a document that addresses the risk assessment approach, the reporting framework, the annual operations calendar, all the processes that go down, and ensuring that you actually have also the playbooks and events and incident management kind of approach. And then if you can get to the place where you're able to define the first line, second line, third line of defense framework, and you probably want to approach a guy like this to help you maybe codify something like that. I think most of the consultants in the space have really done a great job of this thing. Putting it together, I did one. It was painstaking, took me months, but once I had the thing in place, I felt comfortable and confident that my successors and the chain of people who would be taking the roles as we all cycle through would be effective and able to complete this kind of thing. So I think having the governance model and having that thing completely executed and all the partners in agreement and review of it and all of the compliance elements associated with this thing becomes pretty pivotal in having that maturity and that kind of sophistication.
There's one thing I'd add to that. So another just practical, if you're not doing this already, make sure that your risk assessment assessments within your fraud risk assessments speak the same language as your risk taxonomy of your organization.
Right. Critical.
So that's something that I learned. I spent some time first and second line risk, went back to fraud, and I was like, no wonder we're not doing a good job of explaining what's happening, because we're speaking a completely different language than the rest of the organization. So, that's also a relationship builder with your risk teams is, hey, you guys are risk experts. Help us to build the template for doing our fraud risk assessments. You're going to get a whole lot more buy-in with the results, the end result of your risk assessment, if you're using the risk matrix that the organization uses.
And map your taxonomy to your technologies and controls. That's another thing is, end of the day, so I can't tell you how many organizations I go into that have 10 different controls for identity theft, and they don't have an identity theft problem, but they didn't really stop to understand what is the solution I really need to solve the problem. John, you were going to say something.
Totally.
Yeah, I'm going to build on that. It's kind of interesting. We're having this conversation, and governance and risk assessment is really the critical thing we're talking about here. But it's very important. Fraud people are risk managers. It's just a different type of risk. It's different type of outcomes. There's an unwanted outcome, you're mapping to it. So that interaction with your risk team and making sure that, one, from a risk assessment standpoint, you may be pushed down this list of 100 different risks that are there. If it doesn't fit for fraud, work with them. Add the appropriate risks so that you can communicate clearly with them. And then that does get to the technology piece of it. Based off those risks, the instant, severity, the detection, can clearly give you a roadmap on where do I apply my technology needs and where do I need my data.
So I want to ask one more question related to this, and then we'll move on to another section. But it's interesting. I've learned over my career lately that we're not in the business. So much of what we're in is the people business. Frank McKenna says the number one important control in our fraud department is our people. Karen Boyer over here, she was sitting over here, is unbelievably passionate about inspiring her people to do good. Aaron, what is it about? When we talk about people being the backbone of our shops, actually, I'll tell you, fraud management's not just data, right? We have detection analysts and investigators. They're human beings. We're a mix of credit risk, collections, call center, all these components, and operational risk together. It's one of the most brilliant departments and careers. What about people?
So I kind of started this off by saying people are your backbone. And we're a different breed, fraud fighters. We're a little bit different than the rest. We're a little bit kooky, but I say there's some of us that are real kooky. There's some of us that are a little bit more analytical and down in the, right? So still a little kooky though, right? We all get into this and we are attracted to this for a reason. So I think, bringing that to light and making sure that your teams are having fun and enjoying what they're doing. Yeah. We're not spending so much time thinking about, well, you need to develop in this area. Well, yeah, we need to talk about development, but we also, from a leadership perspective, need to put people where they're really going to shine and give them that opportunity. So that's, again, something that I generally do is I get to know people pretty well. They know my dog's names. I know their dog's name. I know what they, fed their children for breakfast yesterday. I get pretty close. But it's built a relationship where you can be vulnerable with your people and they can be vulnerable back. And that's how people grow. So I think, to me, that relationship with your team and taking it a little bit away from the fight. We have very stressful jobs, but we also have very cool jobs. So talking about that with your teams is important as well. We do like speed dating events where we just have people get together from different departments within fraud, different functional areas within the fraud team. Everybody's kind of remote and all over the place now. So it's helpful to, again, humanize the people that work in your team.
I want to share one thing, and then we're going to move to the next section. But it's funny, I inherited a fraud team, and we took this engagement survey when I inherited this team, or I came into the lowest engagement scores across the entire bank. We got them up to the highest engagement scores, and it's interesting, when we got the final results, I looked at the lowest scoring question I had on my team, and it was several hundred people. It was, I understand how my job impacts society. That was the lowest score on my team. And I realized in that moment, as a leader, as I'm trying to inspire people, the fraud people didn't understand that they are directly impacting people, indirectly impacting. So I think that's something we can't skip over as we're optimizing strategies, and we literally are dealing with human beings, and we have to make that connection for them. It's not obvious to everyone. Okay, so future-proof. We're going to move to how do we take a fraud department that we built purposeful for right now and future-proof it for what's to come.
So let me just add this. So I this morning I shared a cab with somebody from the hotel, and she was like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I told her what I did, and she's like, "Oh, so you have like fraud analytics teams? And I was like, absolutely, I do, but I don't do that. I hire the smart people to do that. And she told me, I don't know if she's here, I can't see Wahida. I met her earlier, then we were at lunch together, it was kind of meant to be, but she said she had recently heard a quote, hire smart people for them to tell you what to do. And I was like, that is brilliant. I'm going to use that later today because that is how you future-proof. You have to hire smart people, but if you want smart people to stay, you need to let them be driving the focus of the business in their area of expertise.
That's awesome.
Yeah, let me add to that. The analytical piece of getting those smart people, getting the quantitative folks, it's critical for the future of a fraud shop.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What is even more critical is connecting those smart people with the domain experts, the actual fraud fighters, the investigators, the folks who are on the floor, and building that feedback loop. When machine learning and AI, you sprinkle the magic fairy dust around with AI, when it came into play, everybody thought you just throw the data in, it's going to tell you what to do. What is missing is that domain expertise, and if you look at what is being taught now in the data science schools, there is a component of that within the data science world of how do you bring that domain expertise in, and how do you make those folks feel valued? They can sniff the wind and they can find a fraud pattern. Sometimes it may not pop up from an analytical standpoint, but a tweak or two, you give it to the data scientist, boom, they found
Leave
something.
space for the human and the expertise in it.
I think it's really critical to be focusing really heavily on the technology roadmap and be very focused on where you want to be today and where you want to be, say, at the end of this next contract, right? And what is that going to look like? Because the technologies of today, we don't know what the technologies of tomorrow are going to look like, but we can get very close to what the technologies of, 5 p.m. or, you know what I mean? So if we can start to understand what's valuable now and how we're going to get to tomorrow. So if we're looking at ChatGPT and how bots interact, right? Can we get closer to what's going to be a stronger bot detection engine? Can we get closer to what's going to be a better mousetrap for the problems that we anticipate that are just around the corner? Because I don't think we can get too far. I don't think you can go so far out that you're really smart about that. What you can do is start to look at the contracts and how all these things are going to align and come across.
So you hit two things: create a roadmap, create a strategic plan, and revisit it. I think that's one of the keys. So we a lot of times create a plan. We set the plan for investments for the next 2 or 3 years, and then all of a sudden the technology we planned on maybe isn't as effective anymore, and we need to pivot. So that's good. Okay. Let's see. So I want to talk about, we're going to take some questions here. So to stop fraud, we need to think like a fraudster. Would any of you hire an ex-con on your team to strengthen the defenses?
How many people in the audience have hacked a website before? I mean, that was one of the first things I did. I loved it. That was so much fun when I was a kid. And I think that's kind of like one of those things that most of the people in fraud ops that we kind of have in common, we might be testing the controls. That might be something that we do. And, I've taken no shame in some of the early exploits, and taking further, what are the exploits that are going to occur? So I recall when we first got Apple Pay, and I started taking a look, and I looked over at my friend who's a solution consultant. I'm like, I want your card right now. Let's hack Apple Pay. And that was the first thing that we did, and we realized that the exploit was going to exist on provisioning. And boom, there it was. So I think that's kind of inherent in this operation. And a lot of people will have a lot of value if they can conceive of the ways that things will be exploited. And so think like a fraudster, for me, is a part of my culture that I'm trying to bring to the table when I'm looking for a new hire.
Yeah, I don't know if they'd get through our onboarding process, if I'm being completely honest. However, I do think it's important to hire ex-law enforcement. So earlier when we talked about when, I forgot her name, but she was fabulous, the DA, the New York DA. That is, I think, a very critical role. We're actually hiring for one right now, if you know anybody. The partnership with law enforcement, someone that knows law enforcement, knows how it works, can speak their language so that we can start to go after the bad guys, and they don't want to come to us because guess what? We find them and we prosecute them.
I mean, to be clear, though, you don't want to let a fox into the henhouse, right? So let's not actually hire ex-cons and give them access permission. Let's make sure that we're a little bit more judicious about this thing.
I worked at one bank where we had to let go 4 people in the fraud department when I got there for internal fraud. So you have to be careful, right? And we all basically, again, we're all human beings, and so susceptible of all the pressures of life on a personal side. So I love the people discussion. We're all individual people. We all have pressures outside of work too that sometimes we bring into work, and so we have to, again, be careful on this one. So I want to move to the next question. Best practices when working with model governance teams. I love this one.
Don't.
Easy way to get fired? I don't know. Is that, is
Yeah,
that what it is?
so you can imagine, the group I work with, we're supported by a 400-year-old Asian bank. So from a risk assessment standpoint, very, 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 very strict in their processes. One of the critical things is having domain experts on your own team. So you're not turning this over to someone that doesn't understand the nuts and bolts of modeling. So make sure you have that skill set, or they're the ones that are putting the information together. You need that reputation. You need that bona fide when you're working with model governance teams. So that's number one. Second piece of it, what we've done is work through our procedures. We've worked through our process flows on where does this specific type of prediction fit within the process, and why are we using it here, and what are we expecting from it. We go out there on the floor. There are some amazing folks out there who have built some amazing products. But explaining that and getting it down so where they can evaluate the risk of using it, the uncertainty, how stable is the model going to be, helping them understand where in the process it's going to be used and why you're doing it there, that I've found, regardless of what company I've worked for, that's been a big help working with our model governance.
Can I add and don't roll over. I think that's an important thing too. So many fraud systems out there that are great systems, and whether it's an examiner, I've had that conversation many times. There are a lot of great tools, but you have to understand the tools you're putting into. I think you just can't put it in and walk away and not understand the attributes and be okay. Turning out, were you going to add something now that, Aaron, as you're kind of stepping into a role that may be dealing with some of this?
So yes, but I think one of the things that we did is we recognized one of our data scientists had a skill for producing really great documentation for model governance. And so again, that's looking at your people saying, hey, you're really great at this. Can we put you in a role where you are in charge of this for all of our models? And they are absolutely, that person is thriving.
That's awesome. That's wonderful. Okay, next question. So what are some strategies to turn frontline folks, tellers, et cetera, into fraud fighters? And I honestly tell you, frontline folks, credit risk folks, collection people, I mean, let's expand it. How do you take people that aren't fraud fighters and get them into fraud?
So I have this really spectacular contact center individual. Ayala and I were talking about her a little earlier. She's fantastic at breaking the spell, on the scam side, and she just knew how to engage with empathy and be very human, and take that persuasion capacity and turn it into results. And I think it's very important to understand those people who have the spark, who have that curiosity we were talking about yesterday, and seek those answers and seek those outcomes. One of the core traits that I recognized in her is that she loved to watch these YouTube videos of those guys who want to hack back, the guys who are talking to the scammers. And when she told me that was her hobby, I realized, okay, you got it. You've got the magic. Please come to my team. And the value that she created to my team and the way I was able to grow her and cultivate that kind of curiosity resulted in a very serious warrior. And I love that about her.
So another thing that I think, I'm not doing this yet, but it's on my list. So internal podcasts, internal webinars, and then telling real life stories, and then bringing people from the field in to highlight the amazing work that they did to be able to identify that earlier. So that's on my list to try to get, because when I'm able to go somewhere and actually talk about fraud, I mean, everybody gets a little scared, if I'm being honest, but they also get really pumped up, and it does change the way that they look at things coming across their desk, but it can't be a one and done. It's got to be continual. So that's on my list to engage for my organization.
So I want to Could you guys give 10 seconds? I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think about your parting wisdom for everyone here relates to fraud departments. I want to take an opportunity to encourage all of you while you guys are putting your thoughts together. John, I'm going to start with you. As fraud fighting, we need good people, right? It's one of the most rewarding and amazing careers you can possibly have, and it's not going away. And there's a lot of good people that need good jobs. And it's interesting to me, you can start as a detection analyst or a call center rep. Some of the best I know started in the call center, and a person on a detection queue is now the head of fraud operations at a top 10 bank, a good friend of mine. I will tell you, we need good people. So I was talking to some survivor organizations just several months ago, and they said, we need good jobs, human trafficking survivors. And we can train people that are veterans, human trafficking survivors, vulnerable people, and coach them and teach them into great careers like fraud fighting. This is an amazing community. John, parting thoughts.
Parting thoughts, you nailed it on something I've been asked 3 times during the conferences. Where do you find the analytical talent? where do you find these folks who know fraud? Don't worry about the fraud piece of it. Worry about how they think. Similar to any of these folks, we want folks that are curious. We want folks that are tenacious. We want folks that are problem solvers. If they have the skill sets, whether it is working with customers, whether it's analytics, look in other places. One of the best analysts that I've ever hired, I hired from a brewing company that was doing distribution analytics, but he jumped in and within 2 months was killing it on application fraud side. So look for the traits, you can train the fraud.
Aaron.
So we've talked a lot about collaboration. I'm not going to talk about it at scale, but get to know your fellow fraud fighters. You're both like your peers at other institutions, everybody here, also your vendor contacts, because I can tell you, we're a pretty open group, and that's one of the reasons I love, doing what I do. If anybody calls me and is like, hey, I'm having a problem, what do you think? How can I do this differently? Or do you know? While I was sitting here, I was getting referrals from Jamie Boone he just interviewed someone. I might want to talk to him, and he knows Mary Ann Miller. So it's a very collaborative environment, and you are going to be able to just get so much faster if you do it together.
Awesome. Seth.
Culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's so cliche, but it just holds up year after year. If you can create a good culture, integrity, transparency, honesty, people will want to survive in a very challenging and tumultuous environment. And walking through the pandemic and creating a team with 98% retention from a team that was absolutely in the ashes before, culture eats strategy for breakfast.
So my last word is don't get complacent about your fraud department, because if you take your eye off of building a healthy culture, the right programs and operations and inspired workforce, it's the hardest baby department in a bank, because we touch all these things. We all need to we're intentional, purposeful on a continual basis, because this fight's not going away. Thank you guys for what you do. Thank you, panel. Great job. Wonderful job.